The Texas sun blazed mercilessly overhead as George Strait's black Ford F-150 cruised down the empty stretch of Highway 35, somewhere between San Antonio and Austin. The air conditioning hummed quietly, a stark contrast to the scorching heat that shimmered off the asphalt like liquid mercury. George had just finished a recording session at Arlen Studios and was heading home to his ranch, his mind still echoing with the melodies they'd laid down that afternoon. As he rounded a gentle curve, something unusual caught his eye. In the distance, a figure sat right in the middle of the road, guitar in hand, completely oblivious to the potential danger. George's first instinct was concern. Was this person having a breakdown? An emergency? He slowed his truck and pulled over to the shoulder, dust kicking up behind his tires. The figure was a young man, maybe 19 or 20, with sandy brown hair that caught the sunlight and clothes that had seen better days. His jeans were faded and patched, his boots worn thin, but the guitar in his hands was well maintained and clearly treasured. The boy's eyes were closed as his fingers danced across the strings, producing a melody so pure and haunting that George felt his breath catch in his throat. George stepped out of his truck, the heat hitting him like a wall. He could hear the music clearly now. It was the original composition, something he'd never heard before, but it spoke to him in a way that only truly great music could. The young man's voice joined the guitar, raw and emotional, singing about lost dreams and broken promises, about holding on to hope when everything else has slipped away. "Son," George called out, his voice gentle but firm, "you might want to move off the road before someone comes around that bend too fast." The young man's eyes snapped open, revealing striking blue eyes filled with a mixture of surprise, embarrassment, and something deeper. A pain that seemed far too old for his young face. He scrambled to his feet, clutching his guitar protectively. "Oh God, I'm sorry, sir. I didn't hear any cars coming and I just..." His voice trailed off as recognition dawned in his eyes. "Wait, are you George Strait?" George smiled warmly, tipping his cowboy hat slightly. "That's right. And you are?" Jake Thompson." The young man's voice was barely above a whisper, as if he couldn't quite believe this was happening. "I can't believe, you're actually here, on this road right now." "Well, Jake Thompson, that was some mighty fine playing I just heard. You write that song yourself?" Jake nodded, his cheeks flushing red. "Yes, sir. I write all my own stuff. Music's about the only thing that makes sense anymore, you know." George studied the young man more carefully. There was talent here, raw, undeniable talent, but there was also desperation. Jake's clothes were clean but old. His guitar case was held together with duct tape, and there was a thinness to his frame that spoke of too many missed meals. "What brings you out here, Jake? Playing guitar in the middle of the road isn't exactly the safest way to practice." Jake's expression darkened, and he looked down at his boots. "It's complicated, Mr. Strait. My family, we lost our ranch about 6 months ago. Bank foreclosed. My dad, he's not handling it well. And my mom's working herself to death trying to keep us afloat. This old road, it's quiet most times. I come here to think, to play, helps me forget for a while." The pain in the young man's voice was palpable, and George felt something stir in his chest, a recognition of struggle, of dreams deferred, of the kind of hardship that either breaks a person or forges them into something stronger. "Where are you living now?" George asked. "We're renting a little place in Cedar Creek. It's not much, but it's a roof over our heads. Mom works at the diner in town during the day and cleans offices at night. Dad..." Jake's voice cracked slightly. "Dad's been drinking a lot since we lost the ranch. 5 generations of Thompsons worked that land, and he feels like he failed them all." George was quiet for a moment, processing what he'd heard. He'd grown up understanding the weight of family legacy, the pain of watching dreams crumble, but he'd also learned something else along the way. Sometimes the most unlikely encounters can change everything. "Jake, I need to ask you something." And I want you to be honest with me. How serious are you about music? Is this just a hobby, or is this something you're willing to work for, really work for? Jake's head snapped up, his blue eyes blazing with sudden intensity. Music is everything to me, Mr. Strait. It's the only thing I've ever been good at, the only thing that's ever made sense. I'd give anything for a real chance. Anything's a big word, son. What if I told you I might be able to help you, but it would mean hard work, dedication, and probably some uncomfortable changes? Jake's grip tightened on his guitar. I'd say, when do we start? George smiled, seeing something in the young man that reminded him of his own hunger when he was starting out. Well, first things first. You can't keep practicing in the middle of the road. Why don't you follow me to my ranch? We can talk more there, and I'd like to hear more of your music. Your ranch? I don't have a car, Mr. Strait. I walked here from town. How far is that? About 12 miles. George shook his head, amazed at the dedication it must have taken to walk that distance just to find a quiet place to play. Well, throw your guitar in the back of my truck. I'll drive you home later, but first, let's see what you can really do. As Jake carefully placed his guitar in the truck bed, George noticed the young man's hands were shaking slightly. Whether from nerves, excitement, or something else entirely, he couldn't tell. But as they drove toward his ranch, George found himself thinking about destiny, about the strange ways life brings people together when they need it most. Tell me about your family, Jake. Your parents. Any siblings? It's just me, Mom and Dad. Mom's name is Sarah. She's the strongest person I know. Never complains, never gives up, even when things get really bad. Dad's Michael, but everyone calls him Mick. He used to be the happiest man you'd ever meet, always singing, always had a joke ready. The ranch was his whole world. George heard the love and pain intertwined in Jake's voice. What happened to the ranch? Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring out the window at the passing landscape. Dad got sick a couple years back. Cancer. Beat it, thank God, but the medical bills. And then we had a bad drought, lost most of the cattle. Dad tried to hold on, took out loans against the ranch, but he shrugged helplessly. Sometimes life just hits you with more than you can handle, you know. George did know. He'd seen plenty of good people lose everything through no fault of their own. What's your dad doing now? He picks up odd jobs when he can find them. Construction work, farm labor, but his heart's not in it. Losing that ranch broke something in him, and seeing Mom work so hard while he struggles to find his place, it's eating him alive. As they turned onto the long drive leading to George's ranch, Jake's eyes widened. The Strait ranch was beautiful, rolling green pastures dotted with cattle, well-maintained fences, and a stunning house that spoke of both prosperity and good taste. But George noticed Jake wasn't looking at it with envy or bitterness. Instead, there was a wistful sadness in his expression. "This is how our place used to look," Jake said quietly. "Not as big, but Dad kept it just as neat and pretty. He was so proud of that land." George parked the truck near the main house and helped Jake retrieve his guitar. "Come on, let's sit on the porch. I want to hear more of your music before the sun sets." They settled into comfortable chairs on the wide front porch, the view stretching out over the property. George poured 2 glasses of sweet tea from a pitcher that his housekeeper Rosa always kept ready. "Now then," George said, settling back in his chair, "play me something that means something to you, something from the heart." Jake tuned his guitar carefully, his fingers sure and practiced despite his obvious nerves. When he began to play, George was struck again by the young man's natural ability. This wasn't just talent, this was a gift. The song Jake chose was slow and melancholy, about a father and son working side by side, building something together only to watch it slip away. As Jake sang, George closed his eyes and listened to every note, every inflection. The boy's voice had that rare quality that couldn't be taught, authenticity. He wasn't trying to sound like anyone else, he was just telling his truth through music. When the song ended, George was quiet for a long moment. Jake, how much formal training have you had? None, really. My mom played piano when I was little, taught me some basics. But mostly I just listened to the radio and figured things out on my own. You've been playing how long? Since I was about 10, Dad bought me this guitar for my birthday. Jake's hand moved lovingly over the instrument. It was used then, probably older than I am now, but it was the best gift I ever got. George leaned forward in his chair. Jake, I'm going to be straight with you. You have something special, not just talent. Lots of people have talent. You have that indefinable something that makes people stop and listen. But talent without direction, without proper development, often goes nowhere. Jake's eyes were fixed on George's face, hanging on every word. I'd like to help you, George continued, but this isn't charity and it's not going to be easy. If you're serious about this, really serious, there are things you'll need to learn, ways you'll need to grow. And it's not just about the music, it's about the business, about handling pressure, about staying true to yourself when everyone wants to change you. What would I need to do? Jake asked, his voice steady despite the intensity in his eyes. First, you'd need to come here regularly for lessons and practice. I'd want to work with you on your songwriting, help you develop your stage presence, introduce you to some people in the industry. But Jake, this would mean commitment, multiple times a week, for months. Can you manage that? Jake's face fell slightly. I'd love to, Mr. Strait, but I don't have reliable transportation. And I should be helping Mum more, maybe getting a job. George held up a hand. Let me worry about the transportation for now. As for helping your family, sometimes the best way to help is to build something that can benefit everyone in the long run. But I won't lie to you, this path requires sacrifice, and there are no guarantees. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Jake sat in contemplation, clearly wrestling with the magnitude of what was being offered. Can I ask you something, Mr. Strait? Why are you doing this? You don't know me, don't owe me anything. George smiled, thinking back to his own early days, the people who had believed in him when he was just another young man with a guitar and a dream. Because, Jake, sometimes life puts you in a position to make a difference in someone else's life. And when that happens, you have a choice. You can turn away or you can step up. Your music moved me today. Real, honest music that comes from the soul is getting harder and harder to find. If I can help nurture that, help you reach your potential, then maybe we can create something beautiful together. Jake was quiet for another moment, then looked up with determination burning in his eyes. When do we start? How about Monday? Come by around 10 in the morning. We'll start with some basic exercises, work on your technique, and I'll introduce you to my producer, Mark Davis. He's worked with some of the best in the business. As they loaded Jake's guitar back into the truck for the ride home, George felt a familiar excitement, the same feeling he'd had years ago when he knew he was on the verge of something important. There was something about this young man, something that went beyond just musical ability. The drive to Cedar Creek was quiet, both men lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the small, somewhat run-down house where the Thompsons were now living, George could see the contrast with what they'd lost. The yard was neat despite the modest surroundings, and he could see Sarah Thompson through the kitchen window, her movements efficient and tired as she prepared dinner after what had obviously been a long day. "That's my mum," Jake said, following George's gaze. "She's probably just getting home from her evening shift." "What time does she get up in the morning?" 5:30. "She's at the diner by 6. George shook his head. The woman was working herself to exhaustion. "Jake, before you come Monday, I want you to talk to your parents about this opportunity. They should know what we're planning." "Yes, sir." "Thank you, Mr. Strait, for everything. I still can't quite believe this is real." As Jake headed toward the house, George called out, "Jake, practice this weekend, but don't overdo it. And remember, this is just the beginning." George drove home through the gathering darkness, his mind already working on plans for Jake's development. There was something about the young man that reminded him of why he'd fallen in love with music in the first place, that pure, undiluted passion that couldn't be manufactured or faked. Back at the small house in Cedar Creek, Jake walked through the front door to find his parents sitting at the kitchen table, the remains of a simple dinner between them. Sarah Thompson looked up with tired eyes, while Michael sat hunched over a cup of coffee, the weight of the world on his shoulders. "You're late, honey," Sarah said, though there was no reproach in her voice. "I saved you a plate." Mom, Dad," Jake said, his voice shaking with excitement and nervousness, "you're not going to believe what happened today." Both parents looked up, perhaps hearing something different in their son's voice. Michael's eyes were clearer than they'd been in weeks, curiosity overriding his usual fog of depression and alcohol. "I met George Strait today," Jake announced. Sarah's eyebrows raised skeptically. "The George Strait? Jake, honey, are you feeling okay?" "I'm serious, Mom. He stopped when he saw me playing on Highway 35. He listened to my music, and he wants to help me. He wants to give me lessons, introduce me to people in the music industry." Michael looked up sharply, and for the first time in months, Sarah saw a flicker of the man she'd married in his eyes. "Son, that's incredible, if it's true." "It is true, Dad. He drove me home. You can ask anyone in town. George Strait's truck was parked right outside our house 20 minutes ago." Sarah reached across the table and took her son's hands. "Jake, this sounds wonderful, but we need to be careful. Even if this is real, even if George Strait wants to help you, we can't afford to neglect practical matters. You should be thinking about getting a job, helping us get back on our feet." "Mom," Jake said gently, "what if this is our chance to do more than just get back on our feet? What if this is our chance to really build something?" Michael straightened in his chair, and when he spoke, his voice was stronger than it had been in months. "Sarah, the boy has a gift. We've always known that. If someone like George Strait sees it too." He trailed off, then looked directly at his son. "Jake, this is an opportunity that might never come again. But son, it's also a responsibility. If you're going to do this, you have to do it right. No half measures." The conversation continued late into the night, with Jake describing every detail of his encounter with George Strait. For the first time since losing the ranch, the Thompson family found themselves talking about the future with something that resembled hope. As Jake finally headed to bed, he passed his parents' room and heard something he hadn't heard in months, his father humming quietly while his mother laughed softly at something he'd said. Maybe, just maybe, this strange day had been the beginning of something bigger than any of them could imagine. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp clarity that only comes with a Texas autumn. Jake had barely slept the night before, alternating between excitement and paralyzing anxiety. He'd practiced until his fingers were sore, then practiced some more, determined to prove that George Strait's faith in him wasn't misplaced. At 8:30, a knock came at the Thompsons' front door. Sarah answered to find a middle-aged Hispanic woman with kind eyes and a warm smile. "Good morning, I'm Rosa Martinez. Mr. Strait sent me to drive Jake to the ranch." Sarah's eyes widened. Even the transportation had been arranged. "Jake!" she called. "Your ride is here!" Jake appeared moments later, guitar case in hand, wearing his best jeans and a clean shirt that Sarah had pressed the night before. He kissed his mother goodbye, accepting her whispered encouragement, and climbed into Rosa's comfortable sedan. "Mr. Strait is very excited about working with you," Rosa said as they drove through the countryside. "He's been up since dawn, setting up the music room and calling people. When he gets an idea in his head, there's no stopping him." The drive to the ranch gave Jake time to process what was happening. The landscape rolled by, pastures, farmhouses, the occasional oil derrick, all of it so familiar yet somehow transformed by the circumstances. Everything looked different when viewed through the lens of possibility. At the ranch, George met them at the front door, dressed casually in jeans and a work shirt, but Jake could sense an energy about him, a purposefulness that was both exciting and intimidating. "Morning, Jake. Ready to get started?" "Yes, sir. More than ready." George led him to a room Jake hadn't seen during his previous visit, a sophisticated music studio that clearly doubled as a rehearsal space. Professional equipment lined the walls, and several guitars stood on stands around the room. But what caught Jake's attention was the man sitting at the piano. "Jake, I'd like you to meet Mark Davis. Mark's produced some of the biggest albums in country music, and he's agreed to sit in on our sessions." Mark stood and extended his hand. He was in his 50s, with graying hair and sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see everything. "Pleasure to meet you, Jake. George tells me you've got something special." "I hope so, sir," Jake replied, accepting the handshake. "Hope's got nothing to do with it," Mark said with a slight smile. "Either you have it or you don't. We're here to find out which." George gestured toward a stool in the center of the room. "Let's start simple. I want you to play that song you played for me yesterday, the one about the father and son." Jake settled onto the stool, pulled his guitar from its case, and took a deep breath. The room was silent, except for the gentle hum of the air conditioning. He closed his eyes, found his center, and began to play. The song flowed from him like water, each note clear and purposeful. When he began to sing, his voice filled the room with raw emotion. He wasn't performing for George Strait and Mark Davis. He was simply telling his story, sharing his truth through music. When the last note faded, the silence stretched for what felt like eternity. Jake opened his eyes to find both men staring at him with expressions he couldn't quite read. Mark was the first to speak. "George, you weren't kidding." He turned to Jake. "Son, that was extraordinary. But here's the thing, extraordinary isn't enough in this business. Extraordinary is just the entry fee. What matters is whether you can be extraordinary consistently, under pressure, when the stakes are high." George nodded in agreement. "Mark's right. What you just did was beautiful, but it was also safe. You were in your comfort zone, playing a song you know by heart. The real test is whether you can maintain that quality when we push you outside that zone." For the next 2 hours, they worked on technique. Mark demonstrated advanced chord progressions, while George coached Jake on vocal control and breath management. They had him play the same song 3 different ways, as a ballad, as an up-tempo number, and with a blues arrangement. "Your ear is exceptional," Mark observed during a break. "You're picking up these changes faster than most people with years of formal training, but your technical foundation needs work. Your finger picking is intuitive but inconsistent, and your chord transitions could be smoother." Jake absorbed every word, occasionally asking questions, but mostly listening with intense concentration. This was education at a level he'd never imagined possible. "Now," George said, settling into a chair with his own guitar, "let's talk about songwriting. You mentioned you write all your own material. Walk us through your process." Jake shifted slightly, suddenly feeling exposed. "I don't really have a process, Mr. Strait. Things just come to me, usually when I'm feeling something strongly. I hear melodies in my head, and then words start to fit with them." "Show us," Mark said. "Write something right now about this moment, this experience. Right now in front of you." "Right now," George confirmed. "Don't overthink it. Just let it come." Jake closed his eyes, his fingers finding familiar positions on the guitar. Slowly, a melody began to emerge, tentative at first, then gaining strength. Words started to form in his mind, inspired by the surreal nature of his current situation. "3 days ago I was nobody," he began to sing, his voice growing more confident with each line, "playing to an empty road and an empty sky, and now I'm sitting in a room with legends, trying to figure out if I'm awake or if this is just another dream I'm gonna have to say goodbye to." The song continued for several verses, touching on fear, hope, and the vertigo that comes with sudden opportunity. When he finished, both George and Mark were smiling. "That," Mark said, "is what we call a gift." Most songwriters need to struggle over every word, rewrite constantly, fight for authenticity. You just pulled that out of thin air, and it was honest, melodic, and structurally sound. George leaned forward. "Jake, what you just did usually takes hours or days for most writers, but here's what we need to work on. You rely too heavily on personal experience. Great songwriters can tell other people's stories too, can find the universal in the specific." They spent the rest of the morning on songwriting exercises. George would give Jake a scenario. A woman leaving her small town for the big city, a soldier coming home from war, an elderly couple celebrating their 50th anniversary, and Jake would improvise short musical sketches for each. Some were better than others, but all showed promise. Mark took notes constantly, occasionally stopping to suggest alternative approaches or pointing out particularly effective moments. As noon approached, Rosa appeared with lunch, sandwiches, fresh fruit, and sweet tea. They ate on the porch, the conversation turning from technical matters to the music business in general. "The industry's changed a lot since I started," George said, looking out over his property. "It's more corporate now, more focused on immediate returns, but the fundamentals remain the same. If you can move people with your music, if you can make them feel something real, there will always be a place for you." Mark nodded, wiping mustard from his fingers. "The challenge is staying true to yourself, while also being commercial enough to reach a wide audience. It's a balance that destroys a lot of talented people." Jake listened intently, filing away every piece of advice. "How do you know when you're ready? When you're good enough to actually make it?" "You don't," George said simply. "There's no finish line in music, no moment when you can say, 'Okay, now I've made it.' Every song is a new challenge. Every performance is a test. The goal isn't to get good enough to stop growing. It's to get good enough to grow faster." After lunch, they worked on stage presence. Mark sat at the piano while George coached Jake on movement, eye contact, and connecting with an audience. "Music isn't just about the notes," George explained. "It's about communication. You're not just performing songs, you're sharing experiences, emotions, pieces of your soul. The audience needs to feel like you're singing directly to them, like you understand their lives." They practiced with Jake performing for an imaginary audience, with George and Mark offering feedback on everything from his posture to his facial expressions. It was exhausting work, but Jake found himself improving with each iteration. "Natural performers are rare," Mark observed as they wrapped up the afternoon session. "Most people have to learn how to command a stage. But you've got instincts, raw, unpolished instincts, but they're there." As 5 o'clock approached, George and Jake sat alone in the music room while Mark made some phone calls. "How are you feeling about all this?" George asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, organizing his thoughts. "Overwhelmed, excited, terrified. This morning feels like it happened a week ago. I've learned more about music today than in the previous year combined." "Good. That means you're paying attention. Jake, I want to be clear about something. This isn't going to be easy. We're going to push you, challenge you, probably frustrate you. There will be days when you wonder if you're good enough, if this is all a mistake. And what do I do on those days?" George smiled. "You remember why you started playing music in the first place. You remember that feeling you get when a song comes together perfectly, when you know you've created something that didn't exist before, and you keep working." Mark returned from his phone calls with a thoughtful expression. "Jake, I've been making some inquiries. There's a songwriters circle next Friday night at the Blue Note in Austin. It's informal, but a lot of industry people attend. Would you be interested in performing?" Jake's eyes widened. performing in front of industry professionals after just one day of formal training. Do you think I'm ready for something like that? Probably not, Mark said honestly, but readiness is overrated. Sometimes you learn more from jumping in the deep end than from staying in the shallow water. George nodded in agreement. We'll spend the week preparing you. It'll be good motivation to work hard. As Rosa drove Jake home that evening, his head was spinning with new information, techniques, and possibilities. The landscape looked different again. Not just familiar territory, but the backdrop for a story that was finally beginning to unfold. At home, he found his parents waiting eagerly for a full report. Sarah had prepared his favorite dinner, and even Michael seemed more animated than he'd been in months. "So," Sarah asked as soon as Jake walked through the door, "how did it go?" Jake set down his guitar case and sank into a chair, suddenly aware of how exhausted he was. "It was incredible, Mom, and terrifying, and the hardest I've ever worked." He described the day in detail, the professional music room, Mark Davis's expertise, the songwriting exercises, the stage presence coaching. As he talked, he watched his parents' expressions shift from skepticism to amazement, to something that looked like pride. "They want me to perform at some kind of industry event next Friday," Jake concluded, "in Austin, in front of real music business people." Michael whistled low. "Son, that's major league stuff." "No, I know, Dad. I'm scared I'm not ready." "You know what I think?" Michael said, and Jake was struck by how clear and focused his father's voice sounded. "I think if George Strait believes you're ready, then you probably are. That man didn't get where he is by making poor judgments about talent." Sarah reached across the table and squeezed Jake's hand. "What do you need from us? How can we help?" "Just keep believing in me, I guess." "And Dad?" Jake looked directly at his father. "Mr. Strait asked about you today, about what kind of work you've been doing." Michael's expression shifted, a mixture of embarrassment and curiosity crossing his face. "What did you tell him?" "The truth. That you're struggling since we lost the ranch, that you're looking for work, but your heart's not in it." Michael was quiet for a long moment. "I suppose that's accurate enough. Dad, he said something that stuck with me. He said sometimes the best way to help your family is to build something that can benefit everyone in the long run." "What's that supposed to mean?" Jake chose his words carefully. "I think it means that maybe this opportunity isn't just about me. Maybe it's about all of us finding a new direction." That night, as the Thompson family went to bed, there was a palpable sense of change in the small house. For the first time in months, they were talking about the future with hope instead of dread. It was fragile hope, tentative and uncertain, but it was real. Jake lay awake for hours, his mind racing with melodies and possibilities. His fingers unconsciously moved through the chord progressions Mark had taught him, muscle memory already beginning to form. Outside his window, the Texas sky was vast and star-filled, and for the first time since losing the ranch, the future seemed just as limitless. The week leading up to the Songwriters' Circle at the Blue Note was a whirlwind of intensive preparation. Jake found himself at the Strait Ranch every day, working with George and Mark to refine his performance skills and expand his repertoire. Each session brought new challenges and revelations. On Tuesday, they worked on arrangement and dynamics. Mark sat at the piano while Jake played guitar, teaching him how to build tension and release within a song, how to use silence as effectively as sound. "Music is like storytelling," Mark explained, his fingers dancing across the keys. "You need exposition, rising action, climax, and resolution. Every song should take the listener on a journey." George nodded from his position across the room. "Think about the great songs you love, Jake. They don't just stay at one emotional level throughout. They build, they surprise, they leave you feeling different than when they started." Wednesday brought vocal coaching with a professional voice teacher that George had flown in from Nashville. Patricia Williams was a stern woman in her 60s who had worked with some of the biggest names in country music. "You have natural ability," she told Jake after running him through scales and breathing exercises, "but you're using about 60% of your potential. Your diaphragm control is weak and you're straining your throat on the high notes." For 3 hours, she worked with Jake on proper breathing technique, showing him how to support his voice from his core rather than his throat. It was physical work, demanding and exhausting, but by the end of the session, Jake could hear the difference in his tone. "Better," Patricia said, packing up her materials. "Much better. Practice those breathing exercises every day and come see me in Nashville when you're ready to take this seriously." Thursday was devoted entirely to song selection and stagecraft. They had narrowed Jake's potential setlist down to 3 songs: the original about fathers and sons that had first impressed George, a new composition about second chances that Jake had written during the week, and a cover of Chris Christopherson's "Me and Bobby McGee" that showcased his vocal range. "The key to a good showcase," George explained, "is variety within consistency. You want to show different aspects of your ability, but everything should feel like it's coming from the same artist." They practiced transitions between songs, worked on banter with the audience, and refined Jake's stage movements. Mark videotaped several run-throughs, and they studied the footage together, identifying areas for improvement. "You have a tendency to look down at your guitar too much," Mark observed. "The audience wants to see your face, wants to connect with your expressions. Trust your fingers. They know where the frets are." Friday morning dawned clear and cool, with a hint of winter in the air. Jake woke before his alarm, his stomach a knot of anticipation and nerves. Today was the day he would perform in front of real industry professionals for the first time. At the ranch, George and Mark seemed as nervous as Jake felt, though they tried to hide it. "Remember," George said as they did a final sound check in the music room, "you belong there tonight. You wouldn't be performing if we didn't believe in you completely." Mark handed Jake a new guitar strap, black leather with subtle silver studs. "A little luck never hurt anyone," he said with a grin. The drive to Austin seemed to take forever, and no time at all. Rosa drove while George sat in the passenger seat. Offering last-minute advice and encouragement, Jake sat in the back, his guitar case beside him, trying to calm his racing heart. "The Blue Note is special," George said, turning in his seat to face Jake. "It's where a lot of careers have been launched. Lyle Lovett got his start there, so did Robert Earl Keane. The acoustics are perfect, and the audience knows good music when they hear it." As they pulled into downtown Austin, Jake marveled at the energy of the city. Music seemed to flow from every doorway, street musicians on corners, the promise of something magical in the air. The Blue Note was located on a tree-lined street near the university, its neon sign already glowing in the early evening light. Inside, the venue was intimate and welcoming. Round tables filled a small floor area, with a simple stage at one end, featuring a lone microphone and stool. The walls were covered with photographs of legendary performers, and Jake felt a thrill seeing names he recognized alongside faces he didn't know yet. "Jake Thompson, right?" A tall, thin man with a graying beard approached their table. "I'm David Brennan. I book talent for several venues around Texas. George told me to keep an eye out for you tonight." Jake shook his hand, trying to project confidence he didn't entirely feel. "Nice to meet you, Mr. Brennan. The pleasure's mine. I understand this is your first industry showcase." "Yes, sir." David smiled. "Well, you couldn't ask for a better mentor than George here. He's got an ear for talent that's pretty much legendary in Nashville." As the evening progressed, Jake watched several other performers take the stage. Some were clearly veterans, moving through their sets with practiced ease. Others seemed as nervous as he felt. The audience was attentive but discerning. They applauded politely for competent performances, but came alive for something truly special. "You're up next," the MC announced during a break. Jake Thompson, making his Austin debut tonight. Jake's heart hammered as he walked to the stage, guitar in hand. The lights were brighter than he'd expected, making it difficult to see individual faces in the audience. He adjusted the microphone, settled onto the stool, and took a deep breath. "Good evening," he said, his voice steadier than he felt. "I'm Jake Thompson, and I'd like to share a few songs with you tonight." He began with the father and son song, the one that had first captured George's attention. As the opening chords filled the room, Jake felt something shift inside him. The nervousness didn't disappear, but it transformed into focus. This was what he was meant to do. The audience was silent as he sang, and Jake could feel their attention like a physical presence. When he reached the emotional climax of the song, the moment when the father realizes his legacy will live on in his son, despite losing everything material, he heard someone in the audience sigh audibly. The applause was immediate and enthusiastic. Jake looked out to see George beaming with pride, Mark nodding approvingly, and faces throughout the audience showing genuine appreciation. "Thank you," Jake said into the microphone. "This next song is about second chances, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing." The second song was more upbeat, showcasing his finger-picking skills and vocal range. Jake found himself relaxing into the performance, connecting with the audience in ways he'd only imagined. When he spotted a young woman in the front row wiping away tears, he knew he was reaching people on the level that mattered most. For his final number, he introduced Me and Bobby McGee with a personal touch. This is a song about freedom, about finding joy even when you've lost everything else. It was written by a man who understood that sometimes the journey is more important than the destination. His interpretation of the Christopherson classic was both reverent and personal, staying true to the original while making it unmistakably his own. When he reached the final chorus, several people in the audience joined in, creating a moment of communal music-making that sent chills down Jake's spine. The standing ovation that followed was sustained and heartfelt. Jake stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, until George appeared beside him on stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," George said, taking the microphone, "I think we've just witnessed the beginning of something very special. Jake Thompson, everybody." As Jake left the stage, he was immediately surrounded by people wanting to talk. David Brennan was first in line. "That was exceptional," he said, pulling out a business card. "I'd like to book you for several venues. Are you available next month?" Mark appeared at Jake's shoulder, smoothly intercepting the conversation. "David, Jake's schedule is still developing. Why don't you call me next week and we'll discuss possibilities?" Other industry professionals approached throughout the evening. A woman from a small record label wanted to hear his original material. A booking agent from Dallas expressed interest in getting Jake into some of the better venues in Texas. A journalist from Austin's City Limits magazine asked for an interview. "This is how it starts," George murmured to Jake as they finally made their way toward the exit. "One good performance leads to opportunities, which lead to more performances, which lead to bigger opportunities." On the drive home, Jake was still buzzing with adrenaline and disbelief. Did that really just happen? Did I actually perform in front of all those people? "You did more than perform," Mark said from the front seat. "You connected. That's something you can't teach, and it's something a lot of technically superior musicians never learn to do." George nodded. "Jake, what you did tonight was special, but this is just the beginning. The real work starts now." They spent the drive discussing the evening, what had worked well, areas for improvement, and potential next steps. By the time they reached Cedar Creek, they had outlined a plan for the coming month that included more performances, studio time to record demos, and meetings with industry contacts. At home, Jake found his parents waiting up despite the late hour. Sarah had made coffee, and Michael was more alert and engaged than Jake had seen him in months. "Well?" Sarah asked as soon as Jake walked through the door. Jake sank into a chair, suddenly exhausted. "It went better than I ever imagined possible." He described the evening in detail, the venue, the audience, the other performers, and most importantly, the response to his music. As he talked, he watched his parents' expressions transform from hopeful anxiety to amazement, to something approaching awe. "Son," Michael said when Jake finished his account, "I want you to know how proud I am of you. Not just for tonight, but for how you've handled this whole opportunity. You've shown more maturity and dedication than I've managed in months." Sarah wiped tears from her eyes. "Jake, this is wonderful. But honey, what happens now? Can you make a living from this?" "I don't know yet, Mom. Mr. Strait and Mr. Davis think there's real potential, but they've been clear that success isn't guaranteed. It's going to take a lot of work, a lot of time, and probably some luck." Michael leaned forward in his chair. "Jake, I've been thinking about what you said earlier this week, about this being an opportunity for all of us. I've been feeling pretty sorry for myself since we lost the ranch. Haven't been much use to anyone. Dad, you've been dealing with a lot." Michael held up a hand. "Let me finish. Tonight, watching you chase your dreams, seeing you work so hard for something you believe in, it reminded me of who I used to be. Before the illness, before the financial problems, before I started feeling like a failure." He stood and walked to the window, looking out at the dark street. "I've been offered a job, Jake, managing a ranch outside of San Antonio. It's good work, good pay, and it would mean we could afford a better place, maybe even start saving money again." Jake felt his heart sink. San Antonio was 2 hours from George's ranch, too far for daily lessons. "That's great, Dad. You should take it." "I should, but I'm not going to. Not yet, anyway." Jake looked confused. "Why not?" Michael turned back to face his family. "Because you've got something special happening here, and I'll be damned if I'm going to be the reason you can't pursue it. We'll make do here a while longer. Your mom and I have been talking, and we think this opportunity is too important to walk away from." Sarah nodded. "We've gotten by on less before, and if this leads where we think it might, it could change everything for our family." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes. "Are you sure? I mean, I don't even know if this will work out. What if I'm not good enough? What if nothing comes of it?" "Then at least we'll know we tried," Michael said. "But son, after what I heard about tonight, I don't think failure is something we need to worry about." They talked until nearly 3 in the morning, making plans and sharing dreams that had been dormant for months. When Jake finally went to bed, he lay awake thinking about the rapid changes in his life. A week ago, he'd been an unknown kid playing guitar on an empty road. Tonight, he'd performed for industry professionals and received his first offers for paid work. But more important than any of that was the transformation he was seeing in his family. His father was engaged and hopeful for the first time since the foreclosure. His mother's constant worry had been replaced by excited planning. They were functioning as a team again, working toward a common goal. Outside his window, the Texas sky was beginning to lighten with the first hints of dawn. Jake closed his eyes and let the melodies from the evening play through his mind. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new lessons, new opportunities to grow. But tonight had proven something important. He belonged on that stage, making music that moved people. The road ahead was still uncertain, but for the first time in months, Jake Thompson was exactly where he was supposed to be. 2 weeks after the Blue Note performance, Jake's life had taken on a rhythm he couldn't have imagined a month earlier. Monday through Wednesday was spent at George's ranch, working on new material and refining his performance skills. Thursday was reserved for meetings with industry contacts that Mark had arranged. Fridays and weekends were increasingly filled with performances at small venues around Central Texas. The transformation wasn't just professional, It was personal and familial. Michael Thompson had found new purpose in supporting his son's career, using his organizational skills to help manage Jake's growing schedule. Sarah had reduced her evening cleaning shifts to be available for the family meetings that were becoming a regular part of their week. On this particular Thursday morning, Jake found himself in the offices of Lone Star Music Group, a mid-sized label that specialized in Texas country and Americana. The meeting had been arranged by Mark, who believed the label might be a good fit for Jake's style. Rebecca Martinez, the A&R director, was a sharp-eyed woman in her 40s who had a reputation for discovering authentic talent. She sat across from Jake and Mark in a conference room whose walls were covered with gold records and photographs of the label's artists. "I was at the Blue Note 2 weeks ago," Rebecca said, getting straight to business. "I've also heard the demo tracks Mark sent over. I'm impressed, but I need to understand what you're looking for, Jake. Are you interested in a traditional recording contract, or are you thinking about maintaining more creative control?" Jake glanced at Mark, who had coached him on how to handle this kind of conversation. "Ms. Martinez, I'm interested in making the best music possible and reaching the widest audience I can. The specific structure of a deal is less important to me than finding partners who understand and support my artistic vision." Rebecca smiled. "Good answer. Here's what I'm thinking. You're not ready for a full album yet. Your songwriting is strong, but you need more material, and your performance experience, while impressive, is still limited. What I'd like to propose is a development deal." She outlined a proposal that would provide Jake with studio time to record a 5-song EP, promotional support for live performances, and access to the label's network of songwriters and producers. In exchange, Lone Star would have the option to sign Jake to a full recording contract within the next year. "The advance isn't huge," Rebecca continued, "but it would be enough to support your career development without forcing you to take a day job. Think of it as an investment in your future." Mark took notes throughout the presentation, occasionally asking technical questions about marketing support and creative control. Jake listened intently, trying to process the magnitude of what was being offered. "Can we have some time to consider this?" Mark asked. "Of course. But Jake, I want you to know that opportunities like this don't come along often for new artists. You've got something special, and the industry is starting to take notice." On the drive back to the ranch, Jake was unusually quiet. The weight of the decision ahead felt enormous. This could be the break that launched his career, or it could be a premature commitment that limited his options. "What are you thinking?" Mark asked. "I'm thinking that a month ago I was worried about my family losing our house, and now I'm being offered a recording contract. It doesn't feel real." Mark nodded. "That's a normal reaction. But Jake, here's what you need to understand. This offer validates everything we've been working toward. Rebecca Martinez doesn't make development deals lightly. She sees something in you that's worth investing in." At the ranch, they found George working with a young session musician on some arrangements. When he saw Jake and Mark arrive, he sent the musician on a break and gathered them in his office. "How did it go with Rebecca?" Mark described the meeting and the offer in detail. George listened without interruption, occasionally nodding or making notes. "It's a good offer," George said when Mark finished. "Rebecca's label has a strong reputation, and a development deal gives you room to grow without the pressure of immediate commercial success. But," Jake sensed there was more, "but you need to be absolutely certain this is what you want. Once you sign with a label, even a development deal, you're committed to a path. There are other options. You could continue building your reputation independently, maybe attract interest from larger labels." Jake was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Strait, can I ask you something personal? When you were starting out, how did you know when to take a risk?" George smiled, clearly remembering his own early career decisions. "I had a rule, Jake. If an opportunity scared me and excited me in equal measure, and if it aligned with my long-term goals, then it was probably worth taking. The key was making sure I wasn't just chasing the first offer that came along. That evening, Jake drove home with more questions than answers. The Thompson family gathered around the kitchen table for what had become their weekly planning meeting. Jake laid out the record label offer in detail, including the financial implications and career opportunities. Michael listened with the focused attention he'd once brought to ranch management decisions. "Son, what does your gut tell you?" "That it's a good opportunity, but maybe not the only one. Mr. Strait and Mr. Davis seem to think I should wait a little longer, build up more experience and leverage before committing to anything." Sarah had been quiet throughout the discussion. "Jake, honey, what do you want? Not what the professionals think, not what makes the most financial sense, but what feels right to you." Jake considered the question carefully. "I want to make music that matters, that reaches people and makes them feel something real. I want to honor the gift I've been given and maybe help our family build something lasting. But I also want to make sure I'm not rushing into something because I'm excited or grateful." Michael leaned back in his chair. "You know what I think? I think the fact that you're asking these questions, that you're not just jumping at the first offer, shows you're approaching this the right way." They talked until late in the evening, weighing pros and cons, discussing timeline and alternatives. By the time they went to bed, they had decided that Jake should continue developing his career for at least another month before making any major commitments. The next morning brought unexpected news. Mark called before sunrise with barely contained excitement in his voice. "Jake, you need to get to the ranch immediately. Something big is happening." Jake arrived to find George's office bustling with activity. Mark was on one phone while George spoke quietly into another. Rosa was coordinating what appeared to be a small logistical operation. "What's going on?" Jake asked. George finished his call and turned to face him. "Jake, do you remember me mentioning that I'm friends with the organizers of the Kerrville Folk Festival?" "Yes, sir." "Well, they just had a last-minute cancellation. One of their featured artists had to drop out due to illness, and they need someone to fill a primetime slot tomorrow night. It's short notice, but they're willing to give you the spot if you want it." Jake felt his stomach drop. The Kerrville Folk Festival was legendary, one of the most prestigious acoustic music events in the country. Artists competed for years just to get workshop slots, and he was being offered a featured performance. Tomorrow night, that's barely 24 hours notice. Mark hung up his phone and joined the conversation. "Jake, this is the kind of opportunity that can change everything. The festival draws industry people from all over the country, not to mention music journalists and influencers. If you deliver a strong performance, it could open doors that might otherwise take years to access." "But what if I'm not ready? What if I mess up in front of all those people?" George placed a hand on Jake's shoulder. "Son, there's a difference between being ready and being prepared. You may not feel ready, most performers never do, no matter how experienced they are, but you are prepared. You've got strong material, solid performance skills, and the ability to connect with an audience. The decision has to be yours," Mark added. "If you say no, there will be other opportunities, but opportunities like this one are rare." Jake thought about the record label offer, about the careful timeline they'd discussed the night before, about the importance of not rushing into major decisions. Then he thought about the magic he'd felt on stage at the Blue Note, the connection with the audience, the certainty that this was what he was meant to do. What would I need to do differently for a festival performance? "Longer set," George said immediately. "You'd have about 45 minutes instead of the 15-minute showcases you've been doing. That means 5 or 6 songs plus banter with the audience." Mark pulled out a notebook. "We'd need to expand your repertoire. You've got 3 strong originals, but you'll need at least 2 more songs. We could work on covers or we could write new material." Jake interrupted. "I've had melodies running through my head for weeks. Maybe it's time to get them out." George and Mark exchanged glances. Writing new songs under this kind of pressure was risky, but Jake's natural songwriting ability was one of his strongest assets. "All right," George said. "If we're doing this, we're doing it right. Jake, call your parents and let them know you won't be home tonight. We're going to work until we have a festival-ready set." The next 24 hours were the most intensive of Jake's musical education. They worked on new songs, refined his stage presence for a larger venue, and practiced transitioning between material. Patricia Williams, the voice coach, flew in from Nashville to help Jake prepare his voice for the demands of an outdoor performance. By Friday afternoon, Jake had a 6-song set that showcased different aspects of his ability: the emotional father and son ballad, the upbeat Second Chances anthem, 2 brand new compositions written in the past day, and carefully chosen covers of John Prine and Townes Van Zandt that demonstrated his understanding of the folk tradition. The drive to Kerrville took 2 hours, during which George shared stories about the festival's history and the legendary performers who had graced its stages. "This festival has launched careers," he said, "but more than that, it's where the Texas music community comes together to celebrate what makes our music special." The festival grounds were bustling with activity when they arrived. Multiple stages hosted simultaneous performances. Food vendors served everything from barbecue to funnel cakes, and thousands of music fans wandered between venues. The main stage, where Jake would perform, was an imposing outdoor amphitheater that could hold several thousand people. "Don't let the size intimidate you," Mark advised as they walked past the stage. "Remember, you're not performing for thousands of people. You're performing for each individual person, one at a time." As evening approached, Jake found himself in the performers' area behind the main stage. Other artists, some established, others newcomers like himself, warmed up and ran through last-minute preparations. The nervous energy was palpable, but also exciting. "Jake Thompson?" A festival organizer with a clipboard approached. "You're up in 15 minutes. How are you feeling?" "Ready," Jake said, and was surprised to realize he meant it. George and Mark walked him to the side of the stage as the previous performer finished his set. The audience was engaged and enthusiastic, exactly the kind of crowd every performer hopes for. "Remember everything we've worked on," George said quietly, "but most importantly, remember why you started playing music. That's where the real power comes from." Mark handed Jake his guitar. "You've got this. Trust your instincts and let the music speak." As Jake walked onto the stage, the amphitheater fell quiet. Thousands of faces looked up at him expectantly. The stage lights were bright, but he could see people clearly. Families with children, groups of friends, serious music lovers with notebooks, industry professionals with discerning expressions. "Good evening, Kerrville," Jake said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly across the grounds. "I'm Jake Thompson, and I'm honored to be here with you tonight." He settled onto the stool at center stage, adjusted his guitar, and began his opening song. As the first notes rang out across the amphitheater, Jake felt that familiar transformation, nervousness becoming focus, self-consciousness becoming connection. For the next 45 minutes, Jake took the audience on a journey through his music and his story. He shared the inspiration behind each song, told stories about growing up in Texas, and created moments of intimacy despite the large venue. When he performed the brand new song about finding unexpected mentors, he looked directly at George in the wings and saw tears in the older man's eyes. The audience response was extraordinary. They listened intently during the quiet moments and joined in enthusiastically when invited. By the time Jake reached his final song, his interpretation of Me and Bobby McGee, the entire amphitheater was singing along. The standing ovation seemed to last forever. Jake stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the energy and appreciation flowing from the crowd. When he finally left the stage, he was immediately surrounded by festival organizers, other performers, and industry representatives. "That was exceptional," said a woman Jake didn't recognize. "I'm Jennifer Walsh from Austin City Limits. We'd love to have you on the show." "Outstanding performance," added a man with a Nashville accent. "I'm with Warner Music. When you're ready to talk about a major label deal, give me a call." George appeared at Jake's side, smoothly helping him navigate the flood of attention and business cards. "Gentlemen, ladies, Jake's had a long day. Why don't you reach out to his management next week?" As they finally escaped to a quiet area behind the stages, Mark was practically glowing with excitement. "Jake, do you understand what just happened? You commanded that stage like a seasoned professional. The audience was completely with you from start to finish." George nodded. "Son, in 40 years in this business, I've seen a lot of performers. What you did tonight was special, not just the technical execution, but the way you connected with those people. You made them feel something real." Jake was still processing the magnitude of the evening when his phone rang. It was his father. "Jake, we've been watching the live stream on the festival website. Son, that was incredible. Your mother and I are so proud we can barely speak." As they drove home that night, Jake's mind was spinning with possibilities. The festival performance had changed everything: the level of industry interest, the quality of opportunities being offered, the trajectory of his career. But more than that, it had proven to himself that he belonged on the biggest stages, making music that mattered. "So," Mark said from the passenger seat, "still think we should wait on that record deal?" Jake laughed, feeling lighter than he had in months. "I think maybe it's time to start taking some bigger risks." George smiled in the rearview mirror. "Good, because I have a feeling this is just the beginning." 3 months after the Kerrville Folk Festival, Jake Thompson's life bore little resemblance to the desperate circumstances that had led him to play guitar in the middle of Highway 35. The development deal with Lone Star Music Group had led to his first professional recording sessions, and the 5-song EP they'd produced was generating buzz throughout the Texas music scene and beyond. But the most profound changes weren't in Jake's career. They were in his family. The Thompson household had been transformed from a place of quiet desperation to one of purposeful activity and renewed hope. On this crisp December morning, Jake sat in the newly renovated home office that his parents had created in their spare bedroom. The walls were covered with promotional photos, industry contacts, and a schedule that would have seemed impossible just months earlier. Sarah managed his bookings and correspondence with the efficiency she'd once brought to running a ranch household, while Michael had become his unofficial road manager and business advisor. "Jake, you've got that interview with Texas Music Magazine at 10, Sarah called from the kitchen, where she was preparing breakfast. "And don't forget, the Nashville meeting is next week." The Nashville meeting. Jake still felt a flutter of nerves when he thought about it. 3 major labels were interested in signing him to full recording contracts, and the numbers being discussed were beyond anything the Thompson family had ever imagined. But perhaps, more importantly, the meetings represented validation of the journey they'd all taken together. Michael appeared in the doorway, holding a cup of coffee and a satisfied expression that had become his default since taking over Jake's business management. "Son, I just got off the phone with David Brennan. He's got offers from 6 different venues for New Year's Eve. The money they're talking about." He shook his head in amazement. Jake smiled at his father's enthusiasm. The transformation in Michael Thompson had been remarkable to witness. The broken man who had spent months drowning his sorrows in alcohol had gradually been replaced by someone who approached each day with purpose and energy. Managing Jake's career had given him a way to use his organizational skills and business acumen, while the family's improving circumstances had restored his sense of self-worth. "Dad, remember when you used to tell me that everything happens for a reason?" Michael settled into the chair across from Jake's desk. I remember saying a lot of things when I was feeling sorry for myself. Not all of them were particularly wise, but that one was. Losing the ranch, as terrible as it was, led us to this. I would never have been playing on that road if we hadn't lost everything. George would never have found me. Michael's eyes grew thoughtful. Your mother and I have talked about that. How sometimes what feels like the end of everything is actually the beginning of something better. But son, it wasn't just luck that got you here. You worked for this. Earned it. The phone rang, interrupting their conversation. Sarah's voice carried from the kitchen. Jake, it's George Strait. He says it's important. Jake picked up the extension in the office, his relationship with his mentor having evolved into something resembling family. Good morning, Mr. Strait. Jake, I've got some news. The Country Music Association called this morning. They want to nominate you for the Horizon Award next year. Jake felt his breath catch. The Horizon Award was given to the most promising new artist in country music. Previous winners included Garth Brooks, Keith Whitley, and Alison Krauss. Are you serious? George's laughter carried through the phone. Dead serious. Your EP has caught the attention of the entire industry, and your live performances have been exceptional. Jake, this is exactly the kind of recognition that can launch a career into the stratosphere. As Jake shared the news with his parents, he watched their faces transform with pride and amazement. Sarah sat down heavily in a kitchen chair, her hand over her heart, while Michael pumped his fist in the air like his son had just scored the winning touchdown. There's more, Jake continued, still holding the phone. Mr. Strait, tell them about the tour opportunity. Jake's being modest, George's voice carried through the speakerphone. 3 different major artists have reached out about having him open on their tours next year. We're talking about 40 to 50 dates in major venues across the country. Sarah looked overwhelmed. Jake, honey, this is wonderful, but are you ready for something that big? Touring, being away from home for months? It was a question Jake had been wrestling with himself. The opportunities were extraordinary, but they also represented a fundamental change in his life and his relationship with his family. Mom, a year ago, our biggest worry was whether we'd be able to keep a roof over our heads. Now we're talking about national tours and award nominations. I think we're all a lot stronger than we used to be. Michael stood and walked to the window, looking out at the small yard that had once seemed like a symbol of their reduced circumstances. Sarah, I've been thinking about something. What if we don't have to choose between Jake's career and staying together as a family? What do you mean? I mean, what if we make this a family business? Jake needs management, booking, logistics support. We've already been doing most of that work. What if we formalize it? Jake felt a surge of excitement at his father's suggestion. Dad, are you saying what I think you're saying? I'm saying that maybe it's time for the Thompson family to stop thinking small. Jake's talent got us this far, but it's going to take all of us working together to maximize what we can build. The conversation continued for another hour, with George offering advice and insights from his decades in the music business. By the time they hung up, the Thompson family had outlined a plan that would have seemed fantastical just months earlier. Sarah would transition from her diner job to managing Jake's day-to-day scheduling and correspondence. Michael would handle business negotiations and tour logistics, and Jake would focus entirely on writing, recording, and performing music. It's risky, Sarah admitted as they sat around the kitchen table, notebooks and calendars spread before them. We'd be giving up steady income and depending entirely on Jake's career. Mom, Jake said gently, what we had before wasn't security, it was survival. This might be risky, but it's also the chance to build something that could last for generations. Michael nodded emphatically. Sarah, we've spent the last 6 months watching our son's career take off. The demand for his music is real, the industry recognition is legitimate, and the financial opportunities are substantial. The risk now isn't in pursuing this. It's in not pursuing it aggressively enough. That afternoon, Jake drove to George Strait's ranch for what had become their weekly planning session. The relationship between mentor and student had evolved into something deeper, a friendship based on mutual respect and shared passion for authentic music. "How are your parents handling all the attention?" George asked as they sat on the familiar front porch. "Better than I expected. Dad's found his purpose again, and Mom's finally able to use all her organizational skills on something besides just surviving. It's like watching them come back to life." George smiled, understanding the profound impact that purpose and hope could have on a family. "Jake, I want to talk to you about something serious. The success you're experiencing now, it's real and it's deserved. But the music business can be brutal, even for talented people. How are you handling the pressure?" Jake considered the question carefully. "Honestly, some days it feels overwhelming. The expectations, the schedules, the constant decision-making. But then I remember where we came from, what my family went through, and it puts everything in perspective." "Good. That perspective is going to be crucial as things get bigger. Fame and success can change people, usually not for the better. The Jake Thompson who played guitar on an empty road, don't ever lose that person." "Mr. Strait, can I ask you something? Do you ever regret the path you chose, the sacrifices you had to make?" George was quiet for a long moment, looking out over his property. "I regret some specific decisions, some opportunities I missed with my family because I was focused on my career. But the path itself? No. Music chose me as much as I chose it. The key is making sure you're making music for the right reasons." "What do you mean?" "I mean that when you started playing, it was about expressing something real, about processing your family's struggles and hopes through music. As you become more successful, there will be pressure to write what sells, to perform what's expected, to become a brand rather than an artist. The challenge is staying connected to that original impulse." That evening, Jake performed at a small venue in Austin, one of his last club dates before the larger opportunities began. As he took the stage in front of 200 devoted fans, he thought about George's advice. He opened with the song that had started everything, the father and son ballad about loss and legacy. As he sang the familiar words, Jake looked out at the audience and saw faces that reminded him of his own journey. Young people struggling with their dreams, families dealing with hardship, individuals searching for meaning and connection. "This next song," Jake said into the microphone, "is about second chances, about how sometimes the worst thing that happens to you can lead to the best thing. It's about my family, about losing everything we thought mattered and discovering what actually does matter." As he performed the song, Jake felt the same connection that had drawn him to music in the first place. This wasn't about fame or success or industry recognition. It was about sharing truth through melody, about creating moments of understanding between strangers. After the show, as Jake signed autographs and talked with fans, a young woman approached with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Thompson, I just wanted to thank you. My family lost our farm last year, and we've been struggling. Your music, it helps us feel like we're not alone." Jake felt his throat tighten. This was why music mattered, why all the hard work and uncertainty were worth it. "What's your name?" Emily Rodriguez." "Emily, can I tell you something? A year ago, my family was exactly where yours is now. We lost our ranch, my dad was struggling with depression, my mom was working herself to death just to keep us afloat. I thought our story was over." "What changed?" Jake smiled, thinking of all the unlikely connections that had led him to this moment. "What changed was that we stopped seeing our loss as an ending and started seeing it as a beginning. Sometimes you have to lose everything you think you want to find what you actually need." Emily nodded, wiping her eyes. "It's hard to have hope when everything's falling apart." "I know, but Emily, hope isn't about believing that everything will work out exactly the way you want it to. Hope is about believing that you have the strength to handle whatever comes next, and that there are good people in the world who will help you when you need it most. As Emily walked away, Jake felt a profound sense of completion. The circle that had begun with his own family's struggles had expanded to include strangers who found comfort in his music. This was the real measure of success, not chart positions or award nominations, but the ability to make people feel less alone in their struggles. 3 weeks later, Jake found himself in Nashville, sitting in a conference room at Warner Music Group. The meeting was the culmination of months of negotiations, and the contract on the table represented everything he'd dreamed of since that first day at George Strait's ranch. "Jake," said Amanda Harrison, the label's A&R director, "this is a significant commitment from Warner. We're talking about a 3-album deal with full promotional support, national radio promotion, and a tour budget that will put you in major venues from day one." Mark Davis, who had become Jake's official manager, reviewed the contract terms one final time. "The creative control provisions are exactly what we discussed, and the financial terms are generous for a new artist." Jake looked around the room at the faces of industry executives who just months ago wouldn't have returned his phone calls. "Ms. Harrison, I appreciate the offer, and I understand how significant this opportunity is. But before I sign anything, I need to know that Warner understands what kind of artist I am and what I'm trying to accomplish." Amanda leaned forward. "Tell me. I'm not interested in being manufactured or molded into something that tests well with focus groups. I write songs about real people dealing with real problems. My music comes from my family's story, from the struggles we've overcome together. I want to work with a label that sees that authenticity as an asset, not something that needs to be managed or softened." "Jake," Amanda said with a smile, "that authenticity is exactly why we want to work with you. The industry is hungry for artists who have something genuine to say. Your story, your family's journey from losing everything to building something beautiful, that resonates with people in a way that manufactured emotions never can." The conversation continued for 2 more hours, covering everything from recording schedules to tour routing. When Jake finally signed the contract, he felt both excitement and a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't just his career anymore. It was his family's future and his opportunity to impact the lives of people like Emily Rodriguez. That evening, Jake called his parents from his Nashville hotel room. "It's official," he said when they answered together on speakerphone. "We're signed with Warner Music Group." The celebration that followed could probably be heard throughout their small house in Cedar Creek. Sarah cried with relief and joy, while Michael whooped like his son had just won the lottery. "Jake," Sarah said through her tears, "I'm so proud of you. Not just for this contract, but for how you've handled everything. You've never forgotten where you came from or why you started playing music." Michael's voice was thick with emotion. "Son, do you remember that day when you were 8 years old and you told me you wanted to be a musician? I said you needed to have a backup plan because music was too risky." "I remember, Dad. Well, I was wrong. Music wasn't the risky choice. Giving up on your dreams would have been the risky choice. You've shown our whole family what's possible when you refuse to accept limitations." 6 months later, Jake's debut album, Road to Redemption, was released to critical acclaim and commercial success. The lead single, an updated version of his father and son ballad, climbed to number 3 on the country charts. But more importantly to Jake, fan mail poured in from families who had found hope in his music during their own difficult times. The album release party was held at a venue in Austin, with George Strait serving as the evening's host. As Jake took the stage to perform selections from the new record, he looked out at an audience that included his parents, his mentor, industry executives, fellow musicians, and fans who had followed his journey from the beginning. "A year and a half ago," Jake began, "I was sitting in the middle of an empty road, playing guitar because it was the only thing that made sense in a world that had fallen apart around my family. I thought I was alone, that nobody would ever hear my music or understand what I was trying to say. He gestured toward George in the audience. Then a man I'd admired my whole life stopped his truck and listened. Not because he had to, not because it was good business, but because he recognized something real and wanted to help nurture it. The audience applauded, but Jake wasn't finished. But this isn't just my story. It's the story of my parents, who lost everything they'd worked for, but refused to give up on their family. It's the story of everyone who's ever had their world turned upside down and had to find the courage to rebuild. He began to play the opening chords of a new song, one he'd written specifically for this moment. This is called The Road to Redemption, and it's about the journey we've all taken together. As Jake sang, his voice filled with the same authenticity that had first caught George Strait's attention. The audience was completely still. The song told the story of his family's journey from loss to hope, from isolation to community, from survival to success. But more than that, it was a testament to the power of believing in second chances and the importance of helping others along the way. When the song ended, the standing ovation lasted for several minutes. As Jake stood at the microphone, overwhelmed by the response, he caught sight of his parents in the front row. Sarah was crying openly, while Michael stood with his arm around her, both of them beaming with pride. Later that evening, as the party wound down, Jake found himself on the venue's back patio with George Strait. The older man was smoking a cigar and looking up at the star-filled Texas sky. "How does it feel?" George asked. Jake considered the question. "Surreal, overwhelming, grateful, terrifying." He paused. "Perfect," George smiled. "That sounds about right. Jake, I want you to remember something as your career continues to grow. Success isn't about the charts or the awards or the money, though those things are nice. Success is about staying true to the music that got you here and using your platform to make a positive impact on people's lives." "Mr. Strait, I need to ask you something. Why did you stop that day, really? What made you pull over and listen to some unknown kid playing guitar on an empty road?" George was quiet for a long moment, the cigar glowing in the darkness. "You want the honest answer? I was having a rough day myself. I just left a meeting where some young executives tried to tell me that country music needed to evolve to stay relevant. That authentic storytelling was outdated. I was driving home feeling frustrated and a little defeated. And then I heard your music. Raw, honest, real music that came from the soul. It reminded me of why I fell in love with country music in the first place, and it gave me hope that there were still young artists who understood what this music is supposed to be about." Jake felt tears welling up in his eyes. "So you didn't just save my career that day, I helped save yours too?" "Maybe we saved each other, son." As the evening ended and guests began to leave, Jake's parents approached him near the venue's entrance. They looked tired but radiant, as if they'd just witnessed something miraculous. "Jake," Michael said, "your mother and I have been talking. We want you to know that no matter how big this gets, no matter where your career takes you, you'll always be our son, who played guitar in his room and dreamed of making music that mattered." Sarah nodded. "And we want you to know that watching you chase your dreams has reminded us how to dream again. Your success isn't just about you. It's proof that our family can overcome anything as long as we stick together." As Jake hugged his parents, he thought about the unlikely chain of events that had brought them to this moment. A devastating loss had led to a chance encounter, which had led to mentorship, which had led to opportunity, which had led to success that none of them could have imagined. But more than the professional success, Jake was grateful for the transformation in his family. His parents had rediscovered their purpose and their partnership. They were building something together again, something even stronger than what they'd lost. 6 months later, Jake stood on the stage of the Grand Ole Opry, looking out at the most famous audience in country music, As he prepared to perform Road to Redemption for a national television audience, he thought about all the people who had made this moment possible. George Strait, who had seen potential in a desperate young man and invested his time and reputation in developing it. Mark Davis, who had provided professional guidance and industry connections. His parents, who had sacrificed their own immediate security to support his dreams. And countless fans who had embraced his music and shared their own stories of struggle and hope. "Ladies and gentlemen," Jake said into the microphone, his voice carrying clearly through the historic venue, "this song is about second chances, about finding hope when everything seems lost, and about the people who help us become who we're meant to be." As he began to play, Jake felt the same sense of purpose and connection that had driven him to music in the first place. This wasn't about fame or fortune. It was about using his gifts to touch people's lives, to give hope to families facing their own struggles, and to prove that redemption was always possible. The road that had begun with a desperate young man playing guitar on empty asphalt had led to the most prestigious stage in country music. But Jake Thompson knew that this wasn't the destination. It was just another stop on a journey that would continue as long as he had stories to tell and music to share. In the audience, George Strait watched with paternal pride as his protege commanded the stage with the confidence and authenticity that couldn't be taught. Next to him, Jake's parents held hands and marveled at how far they'd all come together. And somewhere in America, families facing their own dark nights listened to Jake's music and found the strength to believe that tomorrow might be better than today. That, Jake knew, was the real measure of success, not the applause or accolades, but the knowledge that his music was making a difference in people's lives, one song at a time. The road to redemption had led them all home,